Hi, welcome to Bedtime Movie Recap. Today we're going to recap a comedy fantasy movie called Bruce Almighty, so get yourself comfortable and enjoy. The story opens with Bruce in a bakery, spidery hairnet yanked over his forehead, diligently reporting on the largest cookie ever baked in Buffalo. At the end of the sequence, we are introduced to one of the film's running jokes. That's the way the cookie crumbles. Later that night, Bruce watches the news with his live-in girlfriend, Grace Connolly, at a middle-class but homey one-bedroom apartment, sitting on the couch with their dog. Grace tries unsuccessfully to enlist Bruce's help with a photo album commemorating highlights of their relationship, but Bruce is too preoccupied with feeling sorry for himself until he happens upon an X-rated photo of them making love and whisks Grace off to the bedroom. The next morning, Bruce drops Grace off at the Red Cross to give blood. He's still in a bad mood, so she gives him her prayer beads, saying he needs them more than she does. Bruce reluctantly takes the prayer beads, which are useless to him since he never prays, and makes fun of Grace for wasting her time giving blood. At the station, Bruce learns he's being sent into the field to cover an important story at Niagara Falls, assuming from this apparent promotion that he is in line for the anchor position that just opened up. The producer sets the scene in front of the spectacular falls, with Bruce in a comical umbrella hat interviewing an elderly woman about early days at Niagara. Surrounded by the tremendous rushing of the falls, Bruce is interrupted mid-interview for a big announcement from the station, waiting breathlessly to hear that he got anchor. Instead, the position is awarded to Evan, and Bruce has a serious meltdown in front of the camera, repeatedly insulting Evan, verbally abusing the two interviewees, and then capping off his report with the statement, "Back to you." Needless to say, the network fires Bruce, and he is thrown out on the street with all his stuff, including a framed photograph of Walter Cronkite. Bruce arrives home late to dinner and picks a fight with Grace, who tries her best to appease him. In a rage at life, he turns on her, calling their life together mediocre. She takes it personally, which inflames him all the more, and he slams out of the apartment. Increasingly furious, Bruce goes for a drive, shaking the prayer beads and cursing heaven. Back at the apartment next morning, Bruce's beeper starts to go off repeatedly with a high-pitched shriek. He doesn't recognize the number and finally gets so annoyed that he tosses the beeper out into the street. The dog pees on a chair, so Bruce takes him outside, only to hear the flattened beeper still going off in the middle of the street. Aggravated beyond words and unable to stop the beeper from going off, Bruce calls the number and listens to a tape recording of someone who apparently knows everything that's going on in his life. Intrigued, he drives to the address he got over the phone, finding himself in Buffalo's warehouse district. Bruce gets out of car to look for the address, stepping in a huge, filthy puddle that splashes all over his jeans. He enters a warehouse to find that the ground floor is empty except for an African-American janitor mopping the floor. Bruce asks for directions to room 7 on the 7th floor, finding much to his annoyance that the elevator doesn't work. As he heads for the stairs, the janitor asks him to help mop the floor, and Bruce retorts that he would be happy to help in 7 days at 7 o'clock. Arriving on the 7th floor, Bruce finds himself in a huge, empty room that's painted stark white. As he calls out for help, the janitor climbs down a ladder through a hole in the ceiling connected to a brightly lighted room above. Bruce thinks the janitor must have taken the elevator to get there ahead of him, and watches while he strips off his coverall, disclosing much to Bruce's amusement that he is, in fact, God. God proceeds to prove his powers by showing Bruce a file cabinet that contains everything that ever happened in his life. The drawer is so long that it pushes Bruce all the way across the room, then slams shut again, dragging Bruce along behind. Bruce is still skeptical, so he and God play a game where God guesses how many fingers Bruce will hold up. Bruce is finally convinced that something strange is going on when he holds up one hand with 7 fingers, just as God says. God has a plan for Bruce. Since Bruce thinks God isn't doing a very good job, he will give Bruce all his powers and see if Bruce can do any better. Bruce makes a quick exit, not believing a word of what this self-proclaimed God has told him. His car won't start until he bangs his hands on the steering wheel and yells, "Start!" Bruce stops at a diner to order coffee, and the waitress convinces him to add an order of tomato soup. He agrees, then decides to try out parting the Red Sea with his bowl of soup. The soup parts in two. Bruce's hair flies about, amazing another customer. God appears out of nowhere, sitting in the booth across from Bruce as he finally comes to the realization that he does indeed possess all of God's powers. Bruce and God then go for a walk, where God tells Bruce about the 2 rules of his powers. He can't tell anyone he's God, and he can't mess with free will. Bruce then sees a boat sail past. God then leaves Bruce, and Bruce runs off to have fun with his powers. Returning to the center of Buffalo, Bruce struts down the street gleefully. Bruce spies a trendy set of clothes being worn by a mannequin in a shop window, and uses his powers to swap them with his own clothes. As he struts further down the street, Bruce spots the gang that beat him up earlier and decides to get some revenge on them. He demands that they apologize to him, but they just laugh, and Bruce is told by the gang leader that he'll get his apology the day a monkey comes out of his butt. Thanks to Bruce's powers, however, that was that day, and a monkey forces its way out of the man's rear end. The other thugs run off, but are chased by a swarm of bees that Bruce spits out after them. He then commands the monkey to return into the gang leader. Bruce then teleports himself to the top of a skyscraper, creates a lightning storm back at their apartment when she hears Bruce outside singing. When she opens the door, he kisses her and presents her with a bouquet of flowers. While Grace goes to get a vase for the flowers, Bruce heads out onto the balcony, commanding the stereo to play romantic music. He then alters the night sky to make it more romantic. Grace then walks out onto the balcony. They start kissing before Grace runs off to the bathroom to prepare for lovemaking. Bruce then runs into the bedroom, using his powers to turn the lights off. Bruce then decides to use his powers to encourage Grace into the bedroom and give her a bit of a treat. The next morning, Grace watches TV and sees a news report about a tidal wave in Japan, which was caused by unusual lunar activity. Meanwhile, Bruce is still in bed. He is awoken by strange voices in his head, but he quickly shrugs them off. Bruce gets dressed and heads downstairs, surprising Grace with a kiss before sitting down for breakfast. Grace then tells Bruce that when she'd woken up that morning, she'd felt like her chests were bigger. He denies that they're bigger. After getting a bit tongue-tied, Bruce leaves to get his job back. Bruce's plan includes finding the long-missing body of Jimmy Hoffa. When he reports back to the station, everyone applauds, and Bruce is hired back to his old job of reporting on fluff stories that all somehow turn out to be late-breaking news. On Evan's first night as anchor, Bruce uses his special powers to endow him with a humiliating stutter. He tries to be good to Grace, who thinks that he's on the verge of a marriage proposal. They go out for dinner at the restaurant where they first met, and he gets down on his knees in a romantic way, not for a marriage proposal, but to brag that he finally got anchor. Grace is confused and hurt by Bruce's odd behavior and the bizarre things that are happening around the apartment. In the meantime, Bruce starts hearing voices in the background, like a huge crowd that's chattering away at a distance. God appears and informs Bruce that he's hearing the sound of people praying. Bruce tries various ways to deal with all the prayers, finally using a computer program that downloads everybody's prayers like email. He tries to go through all the prayers one at a time but finds it an impossible task. Giving up, he hits a key and yells, "Yes to all." Unfortunately, the network holds a party to celebrate Bruce's promotion to anchor. By now, Grace is completely alienated and refuses to attend. Using his powers, Bruce finds a way to persuade her, but she arrives to find Bruce not quite resisting a beautiful co-worker who's trying to seduce him. This is the last straw for Grace, and she breaks off the relationship. Bruce arrives back at his lonely apartment, finally realizing that he's going to have to start using his special powers to help people in need. He can't use special powers to housebreak his dog. He still tries to use his special powers to try to get Grace back, but it doesn't work since he's breaking one of the rules God gave him, that he can't use his powers to mess with free will. Bruce races back to the warehouse where he first met God and finds him mopping the floor. Coincidentally, it's 7 o'clock on the 7th day since they first met, so God hands Bruce a mop and says, "Right on time." They mop the floor together and Bruce finally understands what he has to do to fix the mess he has made. Bruce makes amends with Evan, ensures that he is reassigned to anchor, and goes back to covering human interest fluff stories. He even finishes the photo album that Grace started to commemorate the highlights of their relationship. When Grace's sister comes to pick up Grace's stuff and sees that Bruce has finished the album, she takes pity on him and tells him that Grace prays for him all the time. Bruce races to his computer and downloads Grace's prayers. A new one comes in and he realizes she's praying for him right then. He watches her cry and, seeing her desperate unhappiness, feels utterly forlorn and helpless, wandering around the city in a state of emotional anguish. Much like the night he got fired, he kneels in the middle of the road to pray and is smacked head-on by an oncoming truck. Bruce suddenly finds himself up in the clouds face to face with God in heaven. They have a conversation during which God teaches Bruce how to pray. When Bruce gets the hang of it, God presses his fingers against Bruce's chest. Bruce awakens to glaring lights in the middle of the road with an EMT defibrillating him. Next, we find Bruce in a hospital bed looking pretty bashed up. Grace comes and climbs in the bed, full of compassion and forgiveness. After his discharge, still in a cast, he returns to the bakery where we found him at the beginning of the film. The bakers display a huge cookie in the shape of a hypodermic needle to promote the Red Cross blood drive, and a huge crowd has gathered to donate. Bruce announces that he and Grace are engaged and goes off with her to give blood, repeating the film's theme. Be the miracle. Thanks for watching Bedtime Recaps. Don't forget to subscribe to watch more movies. Good night.